Welcome to this explainer. Today, we're diving into a genuinely ancient, yet intensely practical blueprint for mastering our own minds. We're going to be looking at teachings pulled directly from some of the most profound spiritual texts in human history, specifically the Bhagavad Gita, and exploring how their timeless principles of self-realization can absolutely transform the way we operate today. Let's face it, if you've ever felt like your own mind is working against you, you're in exactly the right place.
Okay, let's dive right into this. We've got a structured roadmap today, moving from the macro philosophy down to a real-world historical example. We'll start with the field and the knower, then climb the hierarchy of the self. After that, we'll ask, is the mind a friend or a foe? Then we'll tap into the power of self-reliance and wrap it all up with a massive global spiritual awakening.
Section 1. The Field and the Knower.
So before we can even begin to master the mind, we have to ask a really fundamental question. What are we actually made of? And I don't just mean flesh, bone, and biology here. When we say I, what exactly are we referring to? Well, these ancient texts provide a brilliantly analytical answer to that exact question.
The Bhagavad Gita actually breaks our existence down into two completely distinct Sanskrit concepts. First up is kshetra, which translates to the field. Now, this isn't just your physical body. It includes your mind, your intellect, and your ego. Basically, everything making up your personality and physical presence is just a field where you operate. Second is kshetrajna, which means the knower of the field. This is the conscious soul residing within, the silent observer, just watching the field. Understanding this separation is literally step one to mental mastery. You are not your mind. You are the one observing it.
To really lock this concept in, think of a farmer. A farmer doesn't just magically create crops out of thin air, right? They plant seeds in a field and they reap whatever grows. The texts explain that it's the exact same for us. We plant seeds of thought and action into our field, our mind and body, and the quality of those seeds directly cultivates our future destiny. If you plant weeds of negativity, you're going to get a chaotic field. But if you plant seeds of disciplined thought, you harvest peace. Let's move to Section 2 and see how this builds, the hierarchy of the self. Based on Chapter 3 of the Gita, we actually operate on a pretty strict internal hierarchy. Down at the bottom, we have our senses. They're out there interacting with the physical world, just bringing in raw data. Above the senses is the mind, which processes all that data and starts generating desires. Superior to the mind is the intellect, which has the power to discern, judge, and actually make decisions. And finally, supreme over the whole shebang is the soul, the true self. To master yourself, the flow of control has to come from the top down. Your intellect absolutely must guide your mind, which then controls your senses. Because when the senses start dragging the mind around, well, that's when chaos ensues. Which brings us to the central conflict in Section 3, the mind, friend or foe. Chapter 6 of the Gita presents this incredibly stark contrast. The mind itself, it's completely neutral. It's just a tool. The texts describe it kind of like a battlefield. A pure mind, one that you actively saturate with noble ideals and discipline, becomes your absolute greatest ally. But an impure mind, if you just leave it unchecked and driven by wild attachments and sensory desires, it quickly becomes your worst enemy. It is a split camp inside your head, and you are the one who decides which side wins. So, what does actual victory look like? The text defines someone who has mastered their mind as a yoga ruda, or a master of karma yoga. And this person is defined by one major thing: profound detachment. They aren't obsessively attached to material objects, and they aren't anxiously attached to the fruits of their activities either. They renounce worldly resolves. What that means is they're totally free from those insistent inward desires demanding that the world just bend to their exact wishes. They do their duty with absolute laser focus, but without that paralyzing anxiety over the outcome.
But how do we actually pull this off? Let's jump into Section 4, the power of self-reliance.
Listen to this incredibly empowering thought from the great Indian philosopher Swami Vivekananda. Deliver thou thyself by thyself. Do not let thyself sink, for thou art thyself thy greatest friend, and thou thyself thy greatest enemy. This is a massive call to radical personal responsibility. No guru, no teacher, no self-help app is going to do the inner work for you. You literally have to pull yourself out of the mud by your own sheer exertion. But hey, this self-reliance doesn't mean you're totally alone in the universe. Vivekananda's own teacher, Sri Ramakrishna, balanced this idea beautifully. He said, "The breeze of his grace is always blowing. What you need to do is to unfurl your sail. Your self-reliance, your intense daily effort, that is you unfurling your sail. If your sail is all packed away, a strong wind doesn't do you any good. Your effort is the absolute prerequisite to catching the momentum of any spiritual progress.
Let's see how this plays out in history in Section 5, A Global Spiritual Awakening.
Now, what's really interesting here is taking these ancient concepts and seeing them in a tangible, real-world example. The book, The Science of Self-Realization, was compiled from the teachings of A.C. Bhaktivedanta Swami Prabhupada, and his life story is just a stunning modern testament to the sheer power of the philosophical principles we've just been talking about.
When you look at Prabhupada's life, it shows this immense, patient dedication. He was born in 1896, met his spiritual teacher in 1922, who asked him to share Vedic knowledge with the English-speaking world. But it wasn't until decades later, in 1959, that he fully renounced worldly life. And get this, it wasn't until 1965, at an age when most people are deep into their retirement, that he finally traveled to America to fulfill his teacher's request, ultimately founding a worldwide movement in New York just a year later.
The details of that 1965 journey, they perfectly illustrate the supreme detachment and self-reliance of a Yogaruta that we defined earlier. Picture this. At 69 years old, he boards a cargo freight ship called the Jaladuta. He arrives in America with practically nothing, just a trunk of his translated books and the equivalent of about $7. No institutional backing, no wealthy sponsors. He didn't even know where he was going to live. But his mind was pure, fiercely focused, and totally detached from anxiety.
And what was the result of a mind mastered to that degree? Unfazed by his wild circumstances, relying purely on his intellect guiding his mind, he went on to translate and commentate on over 60 volumes of incredibly complex Vedic philosophy into English. He essentially created a spiritual encyclopedia that sparked a massive global cultural movement. Temples, schools, farm communities around the world. That is the real-world power of what happens when the knower completely masters the field.
Which brings us right back to you and that very first metaphor we talked about. Because the exact same fundamental mind that can cross an ocean with $7 and change the world is sitting right inside your head right now. It's a field just waiting to be cultivated. So I want to leave you with this final thought to chew on today. What seeds of thought, action, and habit are you planting in your field right now? Are you cultivating an enemy, or are you cultivating your greatest friend? Reflect on that as you go about your day. Thank you so much for joining me on this explainer, and keep learning.